Because we have the authentication and registration added to our projects, uh, and we are not going to be dealing with them quite yet. We are going to be focusing on doing the migrations for the entities that we are adding. And that is going to require just a couple little tweaks in our directions. I've already added a model. Actually, I did a couple. The model is called members. And at this point, we are familiar with the required data annotation, the string length and range. And there are many additional annotations we will be adding further on down the road. There are some that will validate email and phone numbers and all sorts of different things. So for right now, we're sticking to what we know. And I did create the primary key and I called it ID. It is an integer, which means that Entity Framework is automatically going to make it an identity column, which is what I want. So I'm all good with that. And the only things that are really required or that I'm making required is name. None of the other information in this particular entity is required. And then I also, just for fun, created stats. So a member can have multiple stats. And so the primary key in stats is also ID, and it's an integer, so it's going to be an identity column. You'll notice that the date and time I am filling in. And as far as required data, I have weight and height required. I think I'm also going to make age required just because I have a range in here. And if I don't make it required, then it might create a problem. So I'm going to go ahead and add required to this. And the other thing in here that you'll notice is that I do have the foreign key added. So I took the ID from members and I put the entity name in front or the class name in front. So it's members ID, same data type. And then to let Entity Framework know, I mean, that name in itself is a clue that it's a foreign key. But to let Entity Framework know, I also created the property with the data type of the member's class and the property name of the member's class. So it will recognize this as a foreign key. And let me save all of this. And I'm going to run a little build. And so after we create our class, you guys only need one at this point, then you do want to update Entity Framework. If you have that authentication piece, it did add Entity Framework to your project. If you didn't insert the authentication piece, then you are going to have to add Entity Framework. And we want Microsoft dot Entity Framework core for SQL Server and tools. So I'm going to go into the package manager here. And for those of you that don't have Entity Framework, you're actually going to have to browse for it. And this is the one I want. I'm going to select it, and you can see that it is installed, and I have already run the update. I believe When I created this project, the version was 3.1.7 and 3.1.8 is the most current, so I did do the update. Then you also need the tools. And I did the same thing here. The version that was installed was 3.1.7, so I updated to 3.1.8. So that's all good. And then I also ran a build after. And then my next step was to create the context class and add seed data. And so I called it fitness context. And what I did was I actually copied the movie context file right in here. And then I just changed basically movie context to fitness context. And a lot of what I needed was in here. I had to change the namespace up here to match my namespace. But a lot of this was already entered. It was just a matter of changing the DB set to my entities. And then this is what I want the actual table to be called. So if you want to see that process, I don't really want to key in all this data again. I can kind of show you that. Oh, let's see. So basically you have to find your movie context file, wherever that might be. I mean, you certainly could just type it from scratch if you wanted to do it that way. But when you find the folder with the models from that movie list that we worked on, you can actually just left drag it over here. Okay, and then when you rename it, and I renamed mine to fitness context, it actually asked if I wanted to, do the rename everywhere, and I said yes. And then it fixed pretty much all of the references in this file. The only thing I had to modify then was the namespace. And of course, the DB set. And then I had to come down here and modify the seed data. So I'm going to kind of get rid of this movie context because I don't want it in here. And so I basically just specified what I want for my table names. And then I came down here, and you have to seed if you have multiple tables. And you guys only need one at this point. But when you do have multiple tables, you need to seed the one table before the related table. So in order to have stats, the member has to exist. So I had to put the data into members first. And I do need to make a little modification down here to stats because I've made age required. And so let me fill that in. And I'm just guessing here. We'll make them young. Okay, so now I've got that in there. And we'll do a little save all. And after you do your context class, and that is mine, then you need the connection string. Now, because I have authentication in here, that connection string was already inserted. and it was inserted at the top. And the database name was really long and ridiculous. So I changed it, and I'm actually going to change it here, and I'm going to call it Fitness DB. I mean, you can call it whatever you want. And if there is a problem with your database, uh, what you can do is specify a new database name, delete your migration folder, and then just redo the migrations. And when you do update database, it'll create whatever name you have in here. So it's actually pretty flexible. So at this point, this is done. And then the startup is going to have some code in it already in your configure services. The code for the application DB context, which handles the registration and authentication, has been added. And the connection string is default connection. That means when you add yours, because you are still going to have to add the context that you created, you are going to have to use default connection here. Okay? Because all of this is interrelated. So what we have in our app settings needs to be reflected over here in our startup. And we are now using default connection. And you'll see that I went ahead and added the user-friendly URL a little bit. That's kind of optional. But you are, in order to do the migrations, you are going to have your own context in here. Okay, so this is our dependency injection. And basically our next step then is going to be to do the migrations. So before I do them, I'm just going to run a build. And I'm going to go into the package manager console. And because I have multiple context files, I have to add a context parameter. So I'm going to call this thing initial create, and I'm doing it for the fitness context. Now this is going to create the migration folder, and it's going to create that up method. So I'm just going to quick take a little look here and make sure. So this is where it's going to create my table. I can see my columns, kind of how those are going to be created. I can see that it has the primary key constraint here. Then it's building statistics, and it's making the foreign key constraint, and then it's inserting all of my data. So that all looks good. And down in my down method, you can see that it is deleting both tables. And you'll notice that it's deleting statistics before membership because of that foreign key. So this looks good. Now what I need to do is update the database so that this runs and creates the database and my tables. Now, because I have multiple context files, I am going to have to specify the context here too. So I've got update database, and I have to tell it what context, and it is the fitness context. So as long as this runs correctly and I don't have problems, my database and tables should be created. Okay, so that looks good. Now, what if there's errors and there's problems? And what I would do is fix your problems. I would delete the migrations and just do them over. And if you have a database that's created and it's not right, um, and you want to just do a new one, you can. Okay, so you just go into app settings, give it a different name. While you have this open and you're using it, it's not going to let you go into the SQL Server Object Explorer and delete the database. But eventually you'll be able to delete the one that you don't want. Okay. So at this point, I should have my database. So let's go look. So this is my old one that I don't want anymore. And let me refresh this. And here's my new one. So like I said, I'm not using this. So I can, at this point, delete it. And now I've just got my good new one. And I've got membership and statistics. And so you can see it looks like it did everything correctly. I am going to view the data to make sure my seed data got in there. And it did. And then let me go down to statistics. Make sure that looks good too. Okay, so I got the primary key and the foreign key. And all these values are not null. So all of that looks good. So I'm going to look at the data here too. Okay, so at this point, that database looks fine. So my next step is going to be to generate the controller and views. So I'm going to go back to the Solution Explorer. And there's several different ways to do this. So the technique I'm going to use right now is I'm going to right click on controllers, go to add and choose new scaffolded item. And then what I want is MVC controller with views using Entity Framework. So I'm going to click on add. Then I come in here and I have two models. Now you guys are only probably going to have one. So you're going to choose your model. Then you'll have to choose the context because you have two of those as well. And you want the context you created. Make sure all the check marks are turned on for your views. And then I do not want my controller name pluralized. So I don't want members, I want member. So I'm going to get rid of the S and click on add. And at this point, what it's doing is it is generating the controller and it's going to generate all of the views, which is awesome. Huge time saver. And honestly, it does not take very long considering all the work that it's doing. So if I look in the controller at this point, you'll see I have index, and that is basically grabbing a list from the database, it's just retrieving all of the database rows and passing it along to the view. Then we've got details. Details will actually pass along a specific ID so you can display the information. We have create, which is going to give us an empty form. Here's the post create, which basically checks the model state for no errors. And if it looks good, it goes ahead and adds to our table. And then we have edit. Okay? And edit is also passing along an ID. And it has a post basically to check for errors. And as long as there aren't any problems, it updates the database. And then we get into delete, where it is also passing an ID. And as long as the ID is there, then it finds the member that we're going to delete, and we end up deleting them. Okay, so it finds the member and displays it here. This is the get. And then once you confirm that you want it deleted, it goes through the post and it actually removes the row from the database. So this is our controller. And then when we look down here in our views, you'll see that there is now a member folder, and we have all sorts of views right out of the box that work great. So what I'm going to do, because I have two entities, right? I have two tables. I'm going to generate controller and views for statistics. So I'm going to add a new scaffolded item. And so this model is stats. Everything else looks good, but I'm going to change the name so it's not pluralized. I just don't like the controller names pluralized. I think it looks kind of ridiculous. And homes controller, members controller, stats control. I like them singular. It, it's kind of a personal preference. There's a lot of developers that like it that way. So at this point, I also have now the stat controller with all of the same types of action methods that the member controller has. And then if we look down here, I have my stat views, which are very similar to the member views. So really, the only other thing I need to do is modify my layout here, because I want to add the index, which is the listing for the member and stat data. So I'm going to put them after home. So I'm going to just take about and copy and paste that a couple times. And then we'll adjust it. So the controller that I'm going to go to here is member. And the action method is index. And on the menu itself, I just want it to say members. Okay. And then for stats, the controller is called stat. And the action method is index. And so this is going to be member statistics. Now let me save. Now, eventually what I'm probably going to want is for the member view to connect to the stat view. And when I select a member, I'm going to want to be able to see their stats. But that is something that I'm going to put in further down the road, because we haven't learned how to do that yet. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and run this. Okay, so if I go into members, yeah, I will probably remove address, city, Well, city and state might be useful information. I'm going to remove some of this from here because it's just too much. And I'm actually going to change gender so that it is it ends up being a drop-down list. So if I go to edit, that should work. Yeah, so I want this to be a drop-down list. Edit should give everything. Details. It's fine for details to list everything too, and it's a nice vertical list, so that makes sense. So yeah, there's a couple little tweaks I'm going to make to this. And member statistics. Definitely want to probably change that heading eventually. And I am going to want a link to calculate the BMI. But, you know, as far as you guys are concerned, once you get to this point, you are good. Okay. And you can, as long as you verify that it runs and, you know, all of the CRUD functions are working, you can go ahead and upload to GitHub and turn it in.